In 15 years as a social worker, I've learned that the most pristine family photos often hide the deepest fractures, and the Mason family file was the most pristine I had ever seen. The first thing I saw was a glossy 8 by 10 photo clipped to the folder, a portrait of staged perfection. There were Robert and Eleanor Mason, a handsome, wealthy white couple, smiling with the easy confidence of people who had never known a day of real struggle. They stood in front of a sprawling colonial house that looked more like a monument than a home. Between them, held in their polished embrace, was their 9-year-old daughter Lila. She was a beautiful girl, a black child with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a universe of unspoken thoughts. Her hair woven into 2 impeccably neat braids. But unlike her parents, Lila wasn't smiling. Her face was a void, an unnervingly blank mask that betrayed no emotion at all. It was a haunting emptiness in a sea of manufactured joy. That is the kind of detail you learn to recognize in my line of work. The tiny, almost invisible tear at the corner of a perfect picture that hints at the rot underneath. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and I've been a social worker long enough to know that the prettiest pictures can hide the ugliest, most devastating truths. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. Helps a lot. The call that pulled me into their world came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. It was Eleanor Mason, and her voice was a study in contradictions. It was cultured and impossibly smooth, the kind of voice you'd hear narrating a documentary, but beneath that placid surface, a frantic, high-strung current was buzzing. She was trying to conceal it, but the panic was bleeding through. "It's Lila," she said, her voice pulled so tight it threatened to snap. "She's telling stories again. Vicious stories. But this time it's gone entirely too far." In the world of social services, the Masons were a poster family, what the system triumphantly calls a success story. A wealthy, stable, and influential couple who had opened their hearts and home to a child from the foster care system. They were constantly held up as a shining example of transracial adoption done right, pillars of their affluent community. He was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm. She was a celebrated philanthropist on the board of 3 major charities. And their adopted daughter Lila was, according to the mountain of paperwork in her file, a compulsive and pathological liar. The file was inches thick, a carefully constructed narrative of a deeply troubled child. It was filled with concerned reports from her private school, clinical notes from her pediatrician, and a long chain of frustrated, desperate emails from Eleanor. Lila claimed she was a long-lost princess from a forgotten kingdom. Lila claimed they kept a fire-breathing dragon locked in the basement. Lila claimed she was deliberately starved while her parents ate elaborate feasts in front of her. Every single claim had been investigated by my predecessors and summarily dismissed as childish fantasy, the unfortunate byproduct of early childhood trauma. But this new lie, Eleanor insisted, was different. It was dangerous. Lila had gone to her teacher and claimed that her father, the distinguished Robert Mason, had broken her wrist in a fit of anger. The Masons weren't asking for help for themselves. They were demanding an immediate intervention for their daughter's rapidly deteriorating mental state. As I turned my car into their long, winding driveway, flanked by perfectly manicured lawns, a familiar sense of deep unease settled over me. The house was immaculate, imposing, and eerily quiet. Through a large bay window, I could see Eleanor pacing back and forth in a cavernous living room, a phone pressed tightly to her ear, her movements sharp and agitated. This wasn't a house of chaos. It was a house of absolute rigid control. And in my 15 years of experience, I've learned that suffocating control and explosive chaos are just 2 sides of the same dark coin. Eleanor greeted me at the enormous front door with a smile that was technically perfect, a flawless arrangement of teeth and lips, but it was as brittle as spun glass. It didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice once again smooth as silk as she led me into a grand foyer that looked less like a home and more like a carefully curated museum exhibit. "We're just at our wits' end with her." Robert Mason emerged from a study, a tall, physically imposing man whose presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. His handshake wasn't a greeting. It was a demonstration of power, a subtle warning. He didn't waste a moment, launching directly into a well-rehearsed monologue. "We love Lila more than anything in this world," he began. His voice a deep, authoritative baritone that commanded attention. "But her fabrications, her fantasies, are becoming dangerous. She has a frighteningly active imagination. We honestly thought it was charming at first, a sign of creativity." Eleanor seamlessly picked up the thread of the narrative, a polished tag-team performance. "Her therapist believes it's a severe trauma response from her time in the system. An inability to distinguish reality from fantasy. We've tried everything, Sarah. Absolutely everything. Specialized schools, the best child psychologists in the state." She gestured vaguely, as if listing off luxury brands she'd grown tired of. They expertly painted a heart-wrenching picture of a deeply troubled child, lost in a world of her own making, a child they loved dearly but were failing to save. They explained that her stories were how she processed her traumatic past, but now those stories were escalating, threatening to damage their family, their careers, their pristine reputation. It's true that storytelling can be a powerful coping mechanism for children who have endured trauma. They weave fragments of their real experiences into fantastical narratives to make sense of a world that has hurt them. But the way the Masons spoke about it felt so chillingly dismissive. For them, Lila's stories weren't a cry for help. They were a profound social and professional inconvenience. Then Lila was summoned. She entered the vast living room like a wraith, a tiny silent ghost drifting through a house that was too large for her. Her eyes were locked on the polished hardwood floor, as if she was afraid of what she might see if she looked up. She was small for her age, and an aura of extreme fragility clung to her like a shroud. She perched precariously on the very edge of an oversized, opulent armchair, her hands tucked tightly under her legs as if to keep them from trembling. "Lila, tell Ms. Jenkins why you lied to your teacher, Mrs. Davison," Robert commanded. His voice had shed its compassionate tone. It was now sharp, cold, and prosecutorial. Lila flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound but remained silent, a statue of fear. "She's being defiant now," Eleanor sighed dramatically. "A flawless performance of maternal exhaustion for my benefit. She knows she's in trouble. This is what she does." My eyes were drawn to Lila's left arm. I saw no cast, no brace, no sign of injury. I asked about her wrist. "Oh, that," Robert scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "A complete non-issue. She fell off her bicycle last month. A minor sprain, the doctor confirmed it. Said she'd be fine in a week. She just embellished the story for attention. My job requires a thorough and sensitive inquiry, to uncover the truth, to determine if a child is at risk. That means speaking to everyone involved, the parents, the child, teachers, doctors, anyone who is part of the child's world." I asked to speak with Lila alone. Robert and Eleanor exchanged a brief, loaded look. "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, but her eyes told a very different story. "But I should warn you, she's not very forthcoming. She clams up completely when she feels pressured." They left the room, closing the heavy doors behind them, and the oppressive atmosphere lightened almost instantly. The huge room suddenly felt a little safer, a little more breathable. I pulled my chair closer to the tiny girl swallowed by the armchair. "Hi, Lila," I said, my voice as soft as I could make it. "My name is Sarah. It's my job to listen to kids. That's all." She didn't look up. Her silence was a fortress, a thick, impenetrable wall built of something I couldn't yet name. For 10 agonizing minutes, I asked gentle, open-ended questions about her school, her friends, her favorite color, anything to build a bridge. I received nothing in return. It was like talking to a beautiful porcelain doll. This wasn't defiance. I'd seen defiance countless times. This was terror. The kind of profound, bone-deep fear that steals a child's voice. And in that suffocating silence, a certainty bloomed in my chest. This perfect family, this perfect house, it was all an elaborate stage, and it was all built on a foundation of lies. I just didn't know yet that the lies weren't Lila's. Getting a silenced child to speak is like trying to coax a terrified animal out of a dark cave. You can't force it. You have to be patient, earn their trust, and create a space that feels unequivocally safe. I arranged to meet with Lila again a few days later, but this time at her school. Away from the oppressive perfection and watchful eyes of her home, she seemed to breathe a little easier. Her small shoulders were a little less tense. We sat in the school's art room, a wonderfully chaotic sanctuary bursting with the vibrant colors of paint, clay, and construction paper. I had seen a note in her file, almost an afterthought, that she was a gifted and passionate artist. I didn't ask her about the accusations or her parents. Instead, I asked her about her drawings. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly pulled out a worn sketchbook and opened a door into her real world. The pages were filled with intricate, deeply fantastical scenes. There were towering castles with twisting, ominous spires. Dark, menacing forests where the trees had faces contorted in silent screams. And in every single picture, there was a tiny princess, usually trapped in a tower, hiding behind a locked door, or running from a shadowy beast. Fairy tales and symbols are a child's secret language, a safe way to talk about overwhelming feelings and experiences without having to confront them head-on. I suspected, with a growing sense of dread, that the princess was Lila. "She looks very scared," I said softly, pointing to a drawing of the princess peeking from behind a heavy, bolted door. Lila stared at the drawing, her small finger tracing the outline of the door. "The dragon keeps her there," she whispered, her voice so faint it was barely a breath of sound. "He breathes fire." Her teacher, Mrs. Davison, a warm and genuinely caring woman, had told me that Lila's artwork had grown progressively darker over the past year. "It's like the shadows in her drawings are getting bigger and bigger," she'd said, her brow furrowed with worry. "They're swallowing everything else." And that's when the first real crack appeared in the Masons' perfectly constructed story. I asked Lila about her arm, the one her father had so casually dismissed as a bicycle accident. "Can you show me a picture of when your arm got hurt?" I asked, pushing a blank piece of paper and a box of crayons toward her. She was still for a long moment, then her small hand deliberately selected a dark brown crayon and a bright red one. She didn't draw a bicycle. She didn't draw a park or a sidewalk. She drew the grand, curving staircase from her house. She drew a large, menacing, shadowy figure at the top of the stairs and a small figure, the princess, tumbling violently down. At the bottom of the staircase, next to the princess's outstretched arm, she drew a messy, angry splotch of red. My blood ran cold. "When did this happen, Lila?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. She looked at the classroom calendar on the wall, which was still turned to the month of October for Halloween, decorated with ghosts and pumpkins. She pointed a small, trembling finger at it. "Spooky month," she whispered. The phrase echoed in my mind. Spooky month. October. I could hear Robert Mason's exact words, spoken with such confident disdain. "She fell off her bicycle last month. We were in mid-December. Last month was November." Lila was telling me the injury happened in October. It was a small detail, a minor inconsistency, something anyone else might have missed or dismissed. But it was a discrepancy. And in my world, discrepancies are the loose threads that, when pulled, can unravel an entire tapestry of lies. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. I drove back to my office in a daze, my mind racing, replaying that 1 month difference over and over again. Traumatized children often have fragmented memories and a distorted sense of time. Their brains try to protect them. They might communicate through symbols and metaphors because the direct, unvarnished truth is too terrifying to speak aloud. Was it possible that Lila wasn't lying at all? Was it possible that her fantastical stories about dragons and captive princesses were her brain's desperate, creative way of processing an unbearable reality? The dragon that breathes fire. The large, shadowy figure at the top of the stairs. The Masons presented themselves as a perfect family, but perfect families don't have lurking, shadowy figures. And they don't have children who are so terrified they lose the ability to speak. I opened Lila's thick file again, this time with a new, burning urgency. I finally understood that the answers weren't in the psychologist's clinical reports or the school's behavioral notes. They were buried somewhere deeper, hidden in the bureaucratic labyrinth of the system itself. The Mason file was a monument to their credibility, a testament to their power. It was overflowing with glowing letters of recommendation from influential people, psychological evaluations praising their emotional stability, and financial records that proved their immense wealth. But now I was looking at it all with new, suspicious eyes. I started at the very beginning with the adoption paperwork. It all seemed standard, meticulously prepared. But one document snagged my attention: the approval for a special state adoption grant. Adoption assistance programs are common. They are designed to help parents afford the significant costs of raising eligible children, especially those with histories of trauma from foster care. This particular grant, however, was unusually generous. It wasn't just a one-time payment for legal fees. It was a substantial ongoing monthly stipend, topped off with a significant annual fund specifically earmarked for childhood enrichment services. Things like specialized tutoring, therapeutic summer camps, private art lessons, and equestrian therapy. According to the file, the Masons were exceptionally diligent about using these funds. Every year, they submitted a thick folder brimming with pristine receipts. A $5,000 invoice for a prestigious summer arts camp called Camp Meadowlark, receipts for $200 an hour private tutoring, invoices for music lessons with a renowned instructor. It all looked perfect. As always, too perfect. Something about the sheer volume and cost of those receipts just felt profoundly wrong. It was a gut feeling, that razor-sharp professional instinct you hone over years of witnessing the very best and the absolute worst of human nature. I decided to make a few quiet calls. My hands were trembling slightly as I dialed the number for Camp Meadowlark for the Arts. A cheerful voice answered. I introduced myself and asked if they could verify Lila Mason's attendance over the summer. The woman on the other end was polite and helpful. "Just a moment," she said. I heard the clacking of a keyboard. The silence stretched. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "We have no record of a Lila Mason ever attending our camp. We've never had a child by that name." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. One fake receipt could be a clerical error, a mistake. But this was a very specific, very expensive receipt for a $5,000 program. My hand was shaking now as I dialed the next number. Elite Academics Tutoring. The result was identical. "No, I'm sorry, we have no one by that name in our records." The music school, the therapy center, the equestrian club. One by one I called every single vendor. And one by one, every single receipt the Masons had submitted for 3 straight years was exposed as a complete and utter fabrication. They hadn't spent a single dime of the state's money on Lila's enrichment. They had pocketed all of it. Tens of thousands of dollars a year. Money from the state that was meant to give a vulnerable, traumatized child a better life. The sheer scale and audacity of the deception was breathtaking. This wasn't just about a couple exaggerating a child's behavioral issues to get more support. This was calculated, methodical, long-term fraud on a massive scale. It made me think of those awful, sickening stories you hear where the sacred lines between family and finance become grotesquely twisted, where people exploit the most vulnerable members of society under the guise of love and charity. The Masons hadn't just adopted a daughter. They had acquired an asset. In their cold, calculating eyes, Lila wasn't a child to be loved and nurtured. She was a revenue stream. And her lies, her fantastical stories about princesses and dragons, they weren't just a symptom of her trauma anymore. They were a direct threat to their entire fraudulent enterprise. If Lila ever told an adult the simple truth, not about a mythical dragon, but about the summer camp she never went to or the tutor she never met, their whole world of lies would come crashing down. Their relentless, vicious campaign to paint her as a delusional, pathological liar was a preemptive strike. They weren't trying to get their daughter help. They were trying to discredit their star witness before she could ever testify against them. But I needed more than forged receipts and a discrepancy in a timeline. To take on a family as wealthy and powerful as the Masons, I needed a human witness, someone who could corroborate the abuse. I went back through the dense file, my eyes scanning for any name, any person who might have seen behind the perfect curtain. And then I found her, a name buried in an early assessment from years ago. Maria Johnson, Eleanor Mason's estranged sister. The original report noted that Maria had expressed reservations about the adoption, but her concerns were dismissed by Eleanor, who claimed her sister was simply jealous and emotionally unstable. In my experience, the people dismissed as jealous and unstable are often the only ones telling the truth. Finding her wasn't easy. She had moved and changed her name after a bitter divorce, cutting ties with her sister completely. I finally tracked her down to a small, modest apartment 2 hours away. When I knocked, the woman who answered the door looked like a faded, tired photograph of Eleanor, the same elegant bone structure, but with kind, weary eyes and a warmth her sister completely lacked. The moment I said the name Lila Mason, her face crumpled in on itself. "Oh, that poor baby," she whispered, her voice thick with sorrow as she ushered me inside. For the next 2 hours, Maria filled in all the dark, missing gaps. The Masons weren't old money as they pretended. They had been living on the verge of bankruptcy for years, their lavish, extravagant lifestyle funded entirely by a mountain of debt. Robert's law firm was struggling, and Eleanor spends money like water, Maria said, her voice a raw mixture of anger and sadness. The adoption, for them it was a lifeline. Eleanor found out about this special grant program for high-needs children. She researched it for months. She saw it as a business opportunity, a way to solve their catastrophic money problems and look like saints to the entire world at the same time. Maria had tried desperately to warn the authorities years ago. I told the agency that Eleanor wasn't maternal, that she had no interest in being a mother. I told them they were only doing it for the money. But they saw a rich, white couple and a poor, black kid. They saw the perfect story they wanted to see. They didn't want to listen to me. And then she gave me the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The broken wrist. "I got a frantic call from Lila about 2 months ago," Maria said, her eyes filling with tears that finally spilled over and ran down her cheeks. She was whispering, hiding in her closet. She said Mommy and Daddy had a huge screaming fight about receipts, and that Daddy got really angry and he pushed her down the stairs. She said her arm made a loud crunching sound. Maria had immediately called Eleanor, who furiously threatened her with a restraining order. She even reported it to the local police, but it was her word against the word of the prominent, respected Masons. Nothing was done. Lila hadn't lied about her father hurting her. The Masons had lied about how it happened. They coached her, bullied her, and terrorized her into changing the story to a bicycle accident. They took a real injury, a moment of their own violent, uncontrolled anger, and masterfully twisted it into just another one of Lila's lies. This is the true evil of gaslighting. It's not just denying reality. It's a form of psychological torture that makes the victim doubt their own mind, their own sanity. Lila's stories were a complex, heartbreaking tapestry of truth, metaphor and terror. The dragon in the basement wasn't a fantasy. It was the suffocating presence of her parents' greed and rage. The feeling of being starved wasn't about a lack of food. It was about being starved of love, of care, of safety, of everything a child needs to survive. Her brilliant young mind was trying to communicate the horror of her situation in the only symbolic language she had left. With Maria's powerful testimony and the mountain of forged receipts, I knew I finally had enough. My agency's legal department moved with lightning speed. A formal investigation was launched, not just by Child Protective Services for endangerment, but by the State Attorney General's Office for felony fraud. When we arrived at the Mason house with 2 police officers, the magnificent facade finally, gloriously shattered. Eleanor's practiced, brittle smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, unrestrained fury. Robert blustered, threatened lawsuits, his carefully crafted composure dissolving into the impotent rage of a powerful man who had been caught. As they were being questioned downstairs, I went upstairs to find Lila. She was curled in a tight ball on her bed, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, her tiny body trembling. I sat quietly on the bed beside her. After a long moment, she slowly uncurled and handed the sketchbook to me. She pointed to a new drawing on the last page. It was the little princess, but this time she wasn't trapped or hiding. She was standing in a field of brightly colored flowers, holding hands with a smiling woman who looked just like her Aunt Maria. And for the very first time the princess was smiling. The fallout was swift and total. Robert and Eleanor Mason were charged with felony fraud, embezzlement, and child endangerment. Their perfect reputation, so meticulously constructed, was annihilated overnight. The inspiring story of the community saviors was replaced by the sordid, ugly reality of grifters who exploited a vulnerable little girl for their own financial profit. They had mistaken her deep trauma for childish fantasy and her terrified silence for consent. They saw her not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a transaction to be leveraged. But they made one critical, fatal mistake. They forgot that even the quietest voices can tell the loudest and most powerful stories, if only someone is finally willing to listen. Lila was placed in the temporary custody of her Aunt Maria. A few months later, that custody became permanent. For the first time in her young life, Lila was in a home where she was loved for who she was, not for what she could provide. The fantastical stories of princesses and dragons slowly faded away, replaced by the happy, beautifully mundane life of a normal 9-year-old. Sleepovers with friends, soccer practice on Saturdays, and arguments over homework. The last time I saw her about a year later, she ran up and gave me a drawing. It was a picture of me, holding a giant, ornate key. Beside me was a dragon, but it was small now, curled up and sleeping peacefully at my feet. She had finally tamed it. Cases like this are a stark and painful reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit and a charitable smile. It reminds us that our systems, however well-intentioned, can be manipulated by those who are masters of deception. And most importantly, it reminds us to truly listen to children, to hear not just their words, but the hidden stories they tell, the coded messages they send, and the profound truths hidden deep inside their art and their silence. Every child deserves a champion. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to believe them. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.